I'm joined by Chad Sweet on my right, James Birchfield on my left. Chad, you want to introduce yourself a little?
Sure. Thank you, Gil. So I'm Chad Sweet. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Chertoff Group. Um, I've had a career, as Gil mentioned, both in private and public sector. I was in the CIA as well as at Homeland Security, and did a substantial amount of work in government on cybersecurity policy for the United States government. In the private sector now, we at the Chertoff Group, we advise governments, companies, and high net worth families and individuals on their cybersecurity. And we have a practice that does this on a daily basis, and it's given us the benefit of helping to advance securing the world now outside of government.
Excellent. Great. James.
My background is really foreign policy, critical infrastructure, supply chain security. I spent my public sector career on the Hill, working on several committees focused on these issues. Left and joined private sector, and spent the past 5 years supporting U.S. companies navigate the complexities of critical infrastructure concerns and supply chain security problems.
Great. Well, the term public-private partnership has become a term of art in this town. Um, but in terms of data resiliency, cybersecurity, and the ever-expanding cyber threat, it seems like a deadly serious topic to take seriously. Why is it so important today for public-private partnership in these areas? And what is your assessment of the state of play today?
Well, yeah, I think it's critical if you step back and look at this from a threat perspective. The reason why the public-private partnerships are so essential is it's a different world. If we think back to the nuclear threat, for example, we all saw the movie Oppenheimer. You look at the advent of the nuclear weapons were funded by the government, had all the human talent and the technology. So now when you step back and look at cyber, it is a highly decentralized threat. We'll talk in a minute about the trends that we're seeing on how it's basically becoming more and more accessible. And at the end of the day, the talent and the resources needed to remain at the cutting edge of that threat are no longer in the government. The government's facing certain budget constraints, and if we look at the private sector has a lot more to bring to the table than it did in the nuclear age. So the cash on Apple's balance sheet alone, Gil, could literally buy all of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and General Dynamics together and still have cash left over. So they have tremendous resources to attack this problem. It would be foolish of the US government to not tap into this ally and this tremendous talent and resource in order to confront and counter the adversary.
Yeah. But also, it's such a complex problem that trying to solve this problem without private input would just be a fool's errand,
That's right.
essentially. And James, considering that, 85 to 90% of private of critical infrastructure is privately owned, at least in the United States, it's even more critical for the private sector to be at the table having conversations. But from your perspective, having worked on Capitol Hill on the legislative side of the House, what are the things that government can do to push forward and lead on data resilience and cybersecurity?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Gail. I think there's a couple of key issues that Congress has been and needs to continue to be focused on, namely standardization, right, and ensuring that everybody's working from the same guidelines and the same principles, and creating continuity between private sector within itself as well as public sector and interoperability with public sector. Another major piece of this too is incentivization of private sector, and encouraging private sector to be a good partner to the United States government. And that can be done in a couple of different ways. The old adage carrot and stick, as Chad has indicated previously, the reality is that we've been too focused on the stick and not the carrot. And what we really need to be doing is the US government should be signaling to private sector that if you come to the US government with problems and you say, hey, we have a concern, within our system, that it's a safe place to do it and that you're going to have a partner on the other side of the table who's going to help you, get to the solution rather than, just penalizing you for coming forward and trying to be that good partner. I think this is more important than it's ever been, to the point that Chad made about, the talent being spread throughout private sector and the reality that the US government relies so heavily on private sector solutions and technology now. That also has created a new dynamic that we haven't seen in the past, which is the private sector is now a target of adversaries beyond just the government. And it creates a completely different problem that private sector operators need to be thinking about and how they can work with the U.S. government to harden themselves as well.
Yeah, great answer. As an operational CISO for many years, one of the areas that I try to focus on is information sharing. And our adversaries are attacking us at light speed, and some of us still tend to want to call meetings to defend ourselves. So it's a bit of an imbalance. And one of the things that maybe Chad can comment on this as well on information sharing is the inability of some firms that are attacked on a daily basis to quickly share indicators of compromise of a recent attack out of fear of not having liability protections from the government or regulatory bodies. I know that's an ongoing issue. You're probably very close to that here in town. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely what we used to see, Gil. I know when I was on the government side of the table, we'd hear, from the private sector, and we set up at DHS what are called information sharing analysis centers, or ISACs, and they were set up by individual sectors. And a lot of the complaints you'd hear is the private sector feels like it's just give, 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 and we don't get anything back. And so I think what you've seen evolve, though, is there's been a truly improved collaboration now where the private sector is starting to feel like, hey, we are starting to get more. And what I think was a really good point raised by James is that if you look at the carrot and the stick side, it's also been a shift in the government approach. It used to be if you got breached, it was more, shame on you. How did this happen? And now it's become much more of a victim sympathetic approach where the Bureau and DHS CISA are now leaning in and trying to be proactive in assisting in a breach, but also because now this information sharing between the private and public sector has improved, and as you said, Gil, 85% of the critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. The telemetry that they're getting from that infrastructure and the types of attacks are improving DHS and the FBI's and NSA's ability to forewarn the private sector of attacks that are coming and actually give actionable mitigation advice and guidance. So the benefits to the private sector have improved dramatically. It's no longer just a black hole where they felt like it was all give, give, and no take.
That's great to hear. And I know we're quickly running out of time here. Real quickly, you mentioned a couple of the information sharing, public-private partnership organizations in your last answer. Just off the top of your head, what are some of the things that Chertoff is involved in today?
Yeah, so we've been excited to see what's called, CISA has now set up what's called the JCDC, which is the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. And this is basically a voluntary organization that's allowing cyber defenders worldwide, not just within the U.S. continental boundaries, because cyber knows no boundaries. It's tapping into the best cyber warriors and defenders globally. And that to us is, at the end of the day, you beat a network of adversaries with your own network. And we do have, fortunately, some extraordinarily good talent on the white hat side of the equation. The second thing to look at would be something like the ISACs, which we just mentioned before. It's getting better and better. A third area to look at is the NCIC, which is the National Cyber Communications Information Center. And that's where you're seeing those that control actual network infrastructure collaborating together. And the last is on the FFRDCs, or the think tanks and others, setting up things like the MITRE ATT&CK model and framework, where everybody's starting to contribute into that so that we can start to see sector-specific tactics, techniques, and procedures, and then develop thoughtful mitigations and controls against those specific attack vectors. And that's upping everybody's game. So those are a few of the examples of the types of public-private partnerships our clients are involved in that we are supporting here at the Chertoff Group.
Really good answer. And it's good to see how evolved the federal government has become over the last 20 years. Veeam itself is plugged into the ISAC. We have a leadership role in the IT ISAC. We're engaged with Microsoft and the Crime Consortium. We're deeply engaged because we have to be on supply chain risk management with the U.S. government and the Department of Defense. Last question for you, James. As we come up upon an administration change, do you see any dangers or fears of continuity or lack of continuity in this public-private partnership that's become so important?
Yeah, great question. I think generally, regardless of who's in the White House come November, whether it be Harris or Trump, I think on this issue, we're going to see a lot of continuity. There's a lot of bipartisan support, a lot of recognition and understanding generally and conceptually around the importance of this, right? And as we were just saying, encouraging private sector and government to work together. I think where we're likely to see changes is really they're going to be in the weeds, right? Specifics in legislation, specifics in how regulatory schemes maybe are changed under a Trump administration versus a Harris administration. But as far as companies like Veeam and other companies that play in the critical infrastructure space, my position is that regardless of who's in power in the White House, the course that we're on is probably the right course. And I would encourage private sector to continue to operate with U.S. government in the way that we are all trying to, regardless of who's in the White House.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And we sometimes forget that we've got the civil service there that survives administration, that keeps the continuity going throughout government on multiple levels. So I think we'll be in good shape, like you said. I'm going to turn it back to Chad for final thoughts.
Well, I think one final thought I'd have, Gil, is that this space is a tough space, and sometimes it can sound like gloom and doom. But I think what's fascinating is when we start to see indicators that the good guys are starting to win. And so this is a race without a finish line. We'll constantly have an ever-evolving adversary. But one trend that the Chertoff Group that we're witnessing is there's been this huge surge in ransomware. And that's partly because of the decentralization of tradecraft, where because of script kiddies and ransomware as a service, it's being more accessible to less skilled adversaries. But on the flip side of the equation, and we have seen ransoms estimated in 23 were over 1.1 billion paid. That's double what it was the year before. But on the good side, the encouraging side is we actually saw a drop in those who paid. So it used to be 77% in 2020. It's now down to 28%. And we think it's because, again, the public-private partnership with partners like Veeam, more and more of our clients we're seeing are using solutions like Veeam for disaster recovery and data backup. So if they get that ransomware, they can go tell that criminal to go pound sand.
Yeah.
They can restore their system. So because of this, again, leveraging that excellent technology that's out there, we are seeing the good guys starting to win.
Chad, that's a great way to end this conversation. Clearly, we could go on for another hour. There's so much to talk about in this space, but we've got to turn it back. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today.